as realistic as possible. So, what is the universe? That's speaking to the same question, right? MP equals MP. I think all these things are related, at least in my mind.
I mean, in a really serious way, I think video games sometimes are a little down upon. It's just this fun side activity. But especially as AI does more and more of the difficult, boring tasks, something we in modern world call work. Video games is the thing in which we may find meaning, in which we may find like what to do with our time. You could create incredibly rich, meaningful experiences. Like that's what human life is. And then in video games you can create more sophisticated, more diverse ways of living.
Yeah.
Right?
I think so. I mean, those of us who love games, and I still do, it's almost can let your imagination run wild, right? Like I used to love games, and working on games so much because it's the fusion, especially in the 90s and early 2000s, the sort of golden era, maybe the 80s of the games industry. And it was all being discovered. New genres were being discovered. We weren't just making games. We felt we were creating a new entertainment medium that never existed before, right? Especially with these open world games and simulation games where you as the player were co-creating the story. There's no other media, entertainment media where you do that, where you as the audience actually co-create the story. And of course now with multiplayer games as well, it can be a very social activity and can explore all kinds of interesting worlds in that. But on the other hand, it's very important to also enjoy and experience the physical world. But the question is then, I think we're going to have to kind of confront the question again of what is the fundamental nature of reality? What is going to be the difference between these increasingly realistic simulations and multiplayer ones and emergent, and what we do in the real world?
Yeah, there's clearly a huge amount of value to experiencing the real world, nature. There's also a huge amount of value in experiencing other humans directly in person, the way we're sitting here today.
Yes.
But we need to really scientifically, rigorously answer the question, why?
Yeah.
Exactly. Which aspect of that can be mapped into the virtual world?
Exactly.
And it's not enough to say, yeah, you should go touch grass and hang out in nature. It's like, why exactly is that valuable?
Yes. And I guess that's maybe the thing that's been haunting me, obsessing me from the beginning of my career. If you think about all the different things I've done, they're all related in that way. This simulation, nature of reality, and what is the bounds of, what can be modeled.
Sorry for the ridiculous question, but so far, what is the greatest video game of all time? What's up there?
Well, my favorite one of all time is Civilization, I have to say. That was the Civilization 1 and Civilization 2, my favorite games of all time.
I can only assume you've avoided the most recent one because it would probably that would be your sabbatical. You would disappear.
Yes, exactly. They take a lot of time, these Civilization games, so I've got to be careful with them.
One question: you and Elon seem to be somehow solid gamers. Is there a connection between being great at gaming and being great leaders of AI companies?
I don't know. It's an interesting one. I mean, we both love games, and it's interesting he wrote games as well to start off with. It's probably, especially in the era I grew up in, where home computers just became a thing, in the late 80s and 90s, especially in the UK. I had a Spectrum and then a Commodore Amiga 500, which is my favorite computer ever. And that's why I learned all my programming. And of course, it's a very fun thing to program, is to program games. So I think it's a great way to learn programming, probably still is. And then of course I immediately took it in directions of AI and simulation, so I was able to express my interest in games and my sort of wider scientific interests all together. And then the final thing I think that's great about games is it fuses artistic design, art, with the most cutting edge programming. So again, in the 90s, all of the most interesting technical advances were happening in gaming, whether that's AI, graphics, physics engines, hardware, even GPUs, of course, were designed for gaming originally. So everything that was pushing computing forward in the 90s was due to gaming. So interestingly, that was where the forefront of research was going on, and there was this incredible fusion with art. graphics, but also music and just the whole new media of storytelling. And I love that. For me, it's this sort of multidisciplinary kind of effort is again something I've enjoyed my whole life.
I have to ask you, I almost forgot about one of the many, and I would say one of the most incredible things recently that somehow didn't yet get enough attention is Alpha Evolve. We talked about evolution a little bit, but it's the Google DeepMind system that evolves algorithms.
Yeah.
Are these kinds of evolution-like techniques promising as a component of future superintelligence systems? So for people who don't know, it's kind of, I don't know if it's fair to say it's LLM-guided evolution search.
Yeah.
So it's evolutionary algorithms are doing the search, and LLMs are telling you where.
Yes, exactly. So LLMs are kind of proposing some possible solutions, and then you use evolutionary computing on top to find some novel part of the search space. So actually, I think it's an example of very promising directions where you combine LLMs or foundation models with other computational techniques. Evolutionary methods is one, but you could also imagine Monte Carlo tree search, basically many types of search algorithms or reasoning algorithms sort of on top of or using the foundation model as a basis. So I actually think there's quite a lot of interesting things to be discovered probably with these sort of hybrid systems, let's call them.
But not to romanticize evolution.
Yeah.
I'm only human. But you think there's some value in whatever that mechanism is? Because we already talked about natural systems. Do you think where there's a lot of low-hanging fruit of us understanding being able to model, being able to simulate evolution and using that, whatever we understand about that nature-inspired mechanism to then do search better and better and better?
Yes. So if you think about, again, breaking down the sort of systems we've built to their really fundamental core, you've got like the model of the underlying dynamics of the system. And then if you want to discover something new, something novel that hasn't been seen before, then you need some kind of search process on top to take you to a novel region of the search space. And you can do that in a number of ways. Evolutionary computing is one. With AlphaGo, we just use Monte Carlo tree search, right? And that's what found Move 37, the new kind of never seen before strategy in Go. And so that's how you can go beyond potentially what is already known. So the model can model everything that you currently know about, right? All the data that you currently have, but then how do you go beyond that? So that starts to speak about the ideas of creativity. How can these systems create something new, discover something new? Obviously, this is super relevant for scientific discovery or pushing science and medicine forward, which we want to do with these systems. And you can actually bolt on some fairly simple search systems on top of these models and get you into a new region of space. Of course, you also have to make sure that you're not searching that space totally randomly. It would be too big. So you have to have some objective function that you're trying to optimize and hill climb towards and that guides that search.
But there's some mechanism of evolution that are interesting, maybe in the space of programs, but then the space of programs is an extremely important space because you can probably generalize to everything. But, for example, mutation. So it's not just Monte Carlo tree search where it's like a search. You could every once in a while
combine things,
alter like components of a thing.
Yes.
So then, what evolution is really good at is not just the natural selection. It's combining things and building increasingly complex hierarchical systems.
Yes.
That component is super interesting, especially like with Alpha Evolve and the space of programs.
Yeah, exactly. So you can get a bit of an extra property out of evolutionary systems, which is some new emergent capability may come about.
Yes.
Right, of course, like happened with life. Interestingly, with naive sort of traditional evolutionary computing methods without LLMs and the modern AI, the problem with them was they were very well studied in the 90s and early 2000s and some promising results. But the problem was they could never work out how to evolve new properties, new emergent properties. So you always had a sort of subset of the properties that you put into the system. But maybe if we combine them with these foundation models, perhaps we can overcome that limitation. Obviously, natural evolution clearly did, because it did evolve new capabilities, right? So bacteria to where we are now. So clearly, that it must be possible with evolutionary systems to generate new patterns. Going back to the first thing we talked about, and new capabilities and emergent properties. And maybe we're on the cusp of discovering how to do that.
Yeah, listen, AlphaVol is one of the coolest things I've ever seen. I've on my desk at home, most of my time is spent behind that computer is just programming, and next to the three screens is a skull of a Tiktaalik, which is one of the early organisms that crawled out of the water onto land, and I just kind of watch that little guy. It's like whatever the computation mechanism of evolution is, it's quite incredible.
Yes.
It's truly, truly incredible.
Yeah.
Now, whether that's exactly the thing we need to do our search, but never dismiss the power of nature with what it did here.
Yeah, and it's amazing. Which is a relatively simple algorithm, right? Effectively, and it can generate all of this immense complexity. It emerges, obviously running over 4 billion years of time, but it's you can think about that as again a search process that ran over the physics substrate of the universe for a long amount of computational time, but then it generated all this incredible rich diversity.
So many questions I want to ask. Is one, you do have a dream. One of the natural systems you want to try to model is a cell. That's a beautiful dream. I could ask you about that. I also, just for that purpose, on the AI scientist front, just broadly. So there's a essay from Daniel Kokotayo, Scott Alexander, and others that outlines steps along the way to get to ASI, and has a lot of interesting ideas in it. One of which is including a superhuman coder and a superhuman AI researcher. And in that, there's a term of research taste that's really interesting. So in everything you've seen, do you think it's possible for AI systems to have research taste, to help you in the way that AI co-scientist does, to help steer human brilliant scientists, and then potentially by itself to figure out what are the directions where you want to generate truly novel ideas? Because that seems to be like a really important component of how to do great science.
Yeah. I think that's going to be one of the hardest things to mimic or model is this idea of taste or judgment. I think that's what separates the great scientists from the good scientists. Like all professional scientists are good technically, right? Otherwise it wouldn't have been made it that far in academia and things like that. But then do you have the taste to sort of sniff out what the right direction is, what the right experiment is, what the right question is? So picking the right question is the hardest part of science, and making the right hypothesis. And that's what today's systems definitely they can't do. So I often say it's harder to come up with a conjecture, a really good conjecture, than it is to solve it. So we may have systems soon that can solve pretty hard conjectures. I Maths Olympiad problems. We Alpha proved last year our system got silver medal in that. Really hard problems. Maybe eventually we're going to solve a Millennium Prize kind of problem. But could a system have come up with a conjecture worthy of study that someone like Terence Tao would have gone, you know what, that's a really deep question about the nature of maths or the nature of numbers or the nature of physics? And that is far harder type of creativity. And we don't really know, today's systems clearly can't do that, and we're not quite sure what that mechanism would be, this kind of leap of imagination, like Einstein had when he came up with special relativity and then general relativity with the knowledge he had at the time.
Yes, for conjecture, you want to come up with a thing that's interesting, it's amenable to proof.
Yes.
So like it's easy to come up with a thing that's extremely difficult.
Yeah.
It's easy to come up with a thing that's extremely easy. But at that very edge,
that sweet spot, right, of basically advancing the science and splitting the hypothesis space into two, ideally, right, whether if it's true or not true, you've learned something really useful, and that's hard, and making something that's also falsifiable and within sort of the technologies that you currently have available. So it's a very creative process, actually, highly creative process that I think just a kind of naive search on top of a model won't be enough for that.
Okay, the idea of splitting the hypothesis space into is super interesting. So I've heard you say that there's basically no failure, or failure is extremely valuable if it's done, if you construct the questions right, if you construct the experiments right, if you design them right, that failure and success are both useful. So
Yes.
perhaps because it splits the hypothesis basic too, it's like a binary
Yes.
search.
That's right. So when you do like, real blue sky research, there's no such thing as failure really, as long as you're picking experiments and hypotheses that meaningfully split the hypothesis space. So, and you learn something, you can learn something kind of equally valuable from an experiment that doesn't work. That should tell you, if you've designed the experiment well and your hypotheses are interesting, it should tell you a lot about where to go next. And then you're effectively doing a search process, and using that information in very helpful ways.
So to go to your dream of modeling a cell, what are the big challenges that lay ahead for us to make that happen? We should maybe highlight that AlphaFold. I mean, there's just so many leaps.
Yeah.
So AlphaFold solved, it's fair to say, protein folding, and there's so many incredible things we could talk about there, including the open sourcing, everything you've released. AlphaFold 3 is doing protein, RNA, DNA interactions, which is super complicated and fascinating. It's amenable to modeling. AlphaGenome predicts how small genetic changes, like if we think about single mutations, how they link to actual function. So those, it seems like it's creeping along.
Yes.
So sophisticated, it's much more complicated things like a cell, but a cell has a lot of really complicated components.
Yeah. So what I've tried to do throughout my career is I have these really grand dreams, and then I try to, as you've noticed, and then I try to break them down. It's easy to have a kind of a crazy ambitious dream, but the trick is, how do you break it down into manageable, achievable interim steps that are meaningful and useful in their own right. And so Virtual Cell, which is what I call the project of modeling a cell, I've had this idea, of wanting to do that for maybe more like 25 years. And I used to talk with Paul Nurse, who is a bit of a mentor of mine in biology. He runs founded the Crick Institute and won the Nobel Prize in 2001. We've been talking about it since, before in the 90s. And I used to come back to every 5 years. It's like, what would you need to model the full internals of a cell so that you could do experiments on the virtual cell, and what those experiments, in silico, and those predictions would be useful for you to save you a lot of time in the wet lab, right? That would be the dream. Maybe you could 100x speed up experiments by doing most of it in silico, the search in silico, and then you do the validation step in the wet lab. That's the dream. And so, but maybe now, finally, so I was trying to build these components, AlphaFold being one, that would allow you eventually to model the full interaction, a full simulation of a cell. And I'd probably start with a yeast cell, and partly that's what Paul Nurse studied, because the yeast cell is like a full organism that's a single cell, right? So it's the kind of simplest single cell organism. And so it's not just a cell, it's a full organism. And yeast is very well understood. And so that would be a good candidate for a kind of full simulated model. Now, AlphaFold is the solution to the kind of static picture of what does a protein look, 3D structure of protein look like, a static picture of it. But we know that biology, all the interesting things happen with the dynamics, the interactions. And that's what AlphaFold 3 is the first step towards, is modeling those interactions. So first of all, pairwise, proteins with proteins, proteins with RNA and DNA. But then the next step after that would be modeling maybe a whole pathway, maybe like the TOR pathway that's involved in cancer or something like this. And then eventually you might be able to model, a whole cell.
Also, there's another complexity here, that stuff in a cell happens at different time scales. Is that tricky? It's like protein folding is, super fast.
Yes.
I don't know all the biological mechanisms,
yes.
but some of them take a long time.
Yeah.
And so that's a level. So the levels of interaction has a different temporal scale that you have to be able to model.
So that would be hard. You'd probably need several simulated systems that can interact at these different temporal dynamics, or at least maybe it's like a hierarchical system, so you can jump up and down the different temporal stages.
So can you avoid, one of the challenges here is not avoid simulating, for example, the quantum mechanical aspects of any of this, right? You want to not over model. You can skip ahead to just model the really high level things that get you a really good estimate of what's going
Yes.
to happen.
So you got to make a decision when you're modeling any natural system. What is the cutoff level of the granularity that you're going to model it to that then captures the dynamics that you're interested in? So probably for a cell, I would hope that would be the protein level, and that one wouldn't have to go down to the atomic level. So but of course that's where AlphaFold stuff kicks in. So that would be kind of the basis, and then you build these higher level simulations that take those as building blocks, and then you get the emergent behavior.
Apologize for the pothead questions ahead of time, but do you think we'll be able to simulate and model the origin of life? So being able to simulate the first from non-living organisms, the birth of a living organism.
I think that's one of the deepest and most fascinating questions. I love that area of biology. There's a great book by Nick Lane, one of the top experts in this area, called the 10 Great Inventions of evolution. I think it's fantastic, and it also speaks to what the great filters might be, prior or